A new report was recently released that sets out to examine how state ownership of tobacco companies impacts how tobacco control is supported and implemented around the world. I'm Dom Garrett, and this is your Tobacco Harm Reduction Update. The Contradictions and Conflicts report released in late September explores how state ownership of tobacco companies and government commitments impacts how the FCTC is implemented and supported in certain countries. The FCTC, or the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, is a treaty that was ratified by the WHO, or the World Health Organization. Now, it has the mission to protect present and future generations from the devastating health, social, environmental, and economic consequences of tobacco use and exposure to tobacco smoke. Now, what the report seeks to do is examine specific countries that, on one hand, own 10% or more of a tobacco company, but then on the other hand have signed a treaty that says that they are supposed to implement certain tobacco control measures. Now, one objective of the FCTC is to, quote, reduce continually and substantially the prevalence of tobacco use and exposure to tobacco smoke. And that means that people that sign on to this treaty, countries that sign on, should implement policies to make sure to lower that. However, this report finds that there are 18 countries that own at least 10% or more in a tobacco company, and 17 of those 18, well, they're signatories on the FCTC. And even more than that, 8 of those countries own 100% of a tobacco company. Definitely a conflict of interest. I sat down with the co-author of the report, Daniel Mullan. He is an assistant professor at Trinity College Dublin, where he focuses on business ethics and corporate responsibility. He is also a co-chair of the Business 20 Task Force on Integrity and Compliance.
The report focuses on some contradictions and conflicts within the space of state ownership of tobacco, and the idea was to look at potential discrepancies between governments that are signatories to the FCTC and therefore by definition would oppose tobacco and be part of the tobacco control environment, but at the same time also have commercial interests in the tobacco industry. And just to get a better idea, we decided to look at all countries in the world where governments own at least 10% of a tobacco company. That was the reason for doing the research and writing the report.
I don't want you to have to give a short lecture on ethics, but in the executive summary, you mentioned that it is not unlawful for these countries to sign this treaty. However, it is unethical. And I think for a lot of people, especially people that don't spend their time looking through treaties from the WHO, that might seem it's hard for their brain to sort of process those two things. So can you sort of speak a little bit to that, especially when it comes to something like this that obviously does affect the health of, millions, billions of people around the world?
I think it comes down to the fundamental distinction that you have from an ethical perspective on the difference between what is right and wrong, and from a legal perspective in terms of what is legal or illegal. And we know from experience that those two are not perfectly aligned. So you have cases, and that's where the so-called gray areas in ethical decision-making would often come from, where you have behavior that is perfectly legal, but it can be questioned from an ethical point of view. Sometimes people refer to this as lawful but awful behavior. And again, any company has to deal with this, and that's why you need policies like codes of conduct to guide employees, because cheating on an expense claim or treating your colleagues with disrespect, these things are not illegal. It's not criminal behavior, but it is unethical. And therefore, again, whether it's a big corporation or a government or a state-owned entity, you would expect companies, and we increasingly see this around the world, to be quite clear about the values and the ethical behavior that they espouse and that they would like their employees and the board of directors and the senior executives to adhere to. And in this case, then my argument would be that, to sign up to something that you either disagree with or you're paying lip service to it, but at the same time you're profiting from it, is not illegal. It is allowed by the WHO, and that's where I would question them. And in a perfect world, they could probably go back and correct it, but I don't think that's going to happen. But therefore, governments should ask themselves those ethical questions.
You mentioned in the report the 3 paths forward. Could you just take a second here to give an overview of those, to our audience?
So I discussed the pathways on the assumption that governments go through this process of thinking about their position, and they are, in other words, aware of the fact that there is a conflict of interest, and then they need to know, they need to decide what to do about it. And the first option, of course, is simply to do nothing, to say that we're perfectly happy, with the situation. We can understand that other people might perceive this as a conflict or a contradiction, but we're going to carry on as before. So that's an option. I'm clear about the fact that it still has to be an option that they exercise. So if you just keep on, doing the same thing, that's not a choice that you make, but you can decide things stay as they are. The second option is to get out, to say, oh my goodness, we never realized this, we didn't think about it, we now realize that it was wrong, we should never have been in this business, and let's just get out of it as quickly as possible. That comes with a risk of doing more harm than good because of a couple of reasons. One, that if you just hastily do something without thinking it through, you're probably going to make some mistakes in the process. But more to the point, again, there is a track record of state-owned enterprises that have been privatized in other industries. And usually the reason also why governments do it is when they say, well, we should be governing and businesses, should be managed by business people. And then they actually perform better. And from where we are, from where I'm standing, of course, that's not what you want for a tobacco company, to start doing. Sorry, Siri is interfering here with our conversation. The third option, which is the one that I would prefer, is the pragmatic one, where I say, acknowledge the conflict, acknowledge the contradiction, but also understand that conflicts of interest are things that can be managed. You don't just need to run away when you understand that you are experiencing one. And then the argument of the benefit of being a state-owned enterprise could actually kick in, with some effect, because then if you have a committed government that is not, hostage to short-term shareholder pressures, who understands the bigger picture, then you can actually do some pretty exciting things. And that would be certainly, again, from my perspective, where things like harm reduction would come in, to say, look, we know the reality is that people will continue smoking for some extent. We can't ban it. They tried it during lockdown in South Africa for a while now, and didn't work at all. But we also, can see that there are some pretty fundamental shifts happening around the world in terms of cessation or taking up harm-reduced products, etc. So let's use this as an opportunity to not simply hand over all our assets to the private sector, but to manage this carefully and in that way become part of the tobacco endgame.
As I mentioned, the report is available now, so you can go ahead and check that out in the links in the comment section below. I should also note that the report was produced with help from the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, which is among Vita News's financial supporters. I would also like to mention that we will be hosting a discussion on Vita News Live entitled What's Next for the FCTC, where we will be bringing in expert panelists from around the world to discuss this report and more. So make sure to follow us at vita.news so you do not miss that.